They called it the recurrence. We called it the loop, because that was plainer, and because the Veer hated when we made their sacred things sound like equipment. I had been a foreman for 31 years before any of this. Deep rock, mostly. The kind of drilling where you go down in the dark at the start of a shift and come up in the dark at the end of it. And the only thing that changes between is the depth on the gauge and the ache in your back. 12 hours down, the same 12 hours, the same crew, the same machine screaming the same note, the same dust, the same dripping, the same shift after the same shift until the years stacked up behind you like spent core samples. I tell you that first because it is the only thing about me that mattered to the Veer, though it would take them a long time and a great many resets to understand it. When the Veer found us, they did not come as conquerors and they did not come as friends. They came as recruiters. That was the strange part. Their civilization, as near as any of us could piece together, ran on selection. Everything they were, every office and rank and right, was decided by trial. And the trial they prized above all others was the loop. The principle was simple, which is what made it cruel. They would put you inside a sealed environment, a problem to be solved, a passage to be crossed, a hostile space to be endured, and you would fail because the first time you always failed. The thing was built so you would, and then it would reset. The same room, the same air, the same threats, the same handholds in the same places, the same moment ticking forward from the same start. Identical, bit for bit. You went around again, and again, and again. The trial did not get harder. It did not change at all. That was the whole engine of it. It changed nothing and made you live it over and over until something inside you broke. For the Veer, that was the deadliest thing in the universe. I did not understand why at first. None of us did. Their minds, Overseer Valoran explained to me once long after, when he had stopped pretending I was beneath explaining things to were not built like ours. He used a word their translators rendered as lattice. A Veer mind held the world as a vast structure of connections, every new thing slotting into the frame growing, the frame being the self. They lived for the new. A Veer who saw a fresh sky, learned a fresh fact, took a fresh route home, felt their lattice grow, and that growing was, to them, the sensation of being alive. It was their joy and their hunger and their reason. And repetition starved it. The same thing twice gave the lattice nothing to add. The same thing 3 times began to ache. By the 5th or 6th identical recurrence, a Veer mind started to do something Valoran could only describe as bleeding, connections fraying where there was nothing new to anchor them, the structure turning on itself for want of fresh material, the self coming apart at its own joints. They called it recurrence sickness. A Veer could endure perhaps 4 or 5 iterations of the loop before the bleeding became unbearable. The very finest of them, the ones whose names were carved into the walls of the iteration hall, had survived 8. 9 was legend. 10 had been done once, by a Veer whose statue stood in the entrance court with its hands open, as if it had been caught in the middle of letting something go. So you understand what the loop meant to them. To survive, it was to prove your mind could withstand the one thing their kind found unsurvivable: sameness. Repetition tolerance was, to the Veer, the rarest and most precious quality a thinking creature could possess. It was the trait of the ruler, the deep thinker, the one fit to command, because command meant doing the dull necessary thing again and yesterday and tomorrow without your mind dissolving under the weight of its own monotony. They built their whole order on filtering for it, and they had begun, recently, to wonder whether other species had it too, whether somewhere out in the dark there were minds even tougher than the toughest Veer. That is why they recruited us. Not to fight, to test. We were a new species and they wanted to know what our minds were made of, and the loop was how they measured it. I was in the second intake. There were 11 of us, pulled from across Earth on the strength of nothing anyone could name. The Veer had selection criteria we never cracked, and to this day I do not know why they picked a 54-year-old drill foreman with bad knees and a fused vertebra. I have a guess now. I did not have one then. I only knew I had been taken up to a station that hung in orbit like a white seed pod, all curved halls and cool light and air that smelled faintly of cut metal, and that I was to be put through their trial alongside their own young. The iteration hall was the brightest room I had ever stood in. The veilleur did not do darkness. Darkness, I would learn, was just another kind of sameness to them, an absence of new things to see, and they hated it. So the hall was lit like noon. White walls, silver fittings, banks of pale blue light running in seams along the floor, a great glass observation gallery rising on one side where the instructors stood in their long gray robes and watched. There were a dozen sealed cells along the far wall, each a smooth-doored chamber the size of a small house. And there were the cadets. I want to be fair to the veilleur cadets because what happened to them was not their fault and most of them were brave. They were young by their reckoning anyway. Tall, smooth-skinned creatures the color of wet slate, with too many joints in their limbs and eyes that held no whites, just deep wells of dark that caught the light and threw it back. They moved beautifully. They were frightened in a way they were too proud to show, and they had every reason to be, because the trial they were about to enter had broken minds older and stronger than theirs, and they knew it. I stood among them in a borrowed gray suit that did not fit my shoulders, and I waited, and I did not feel much of anything. That is not bravery. I want to be clear about that too. I have heard people since make me out to be some iron-nerved hero, and that is not what I was. The truth is duller, and it is the whole point of this story. I did not feel much of anything because I had spent 31 years learning not to. A man does not last 3 decades on the same deep shaft rotation by feeling things about it. You clock in. You do the work. You clock out. The rock does not care how you feel, and neither does the gauge, and after enough years your mind simply stops asking the question. I had a callus over the place where dread should have been. I had built it one identical morning at a time, and I had not even known I was building it. Overseer Valoran addressed us before the first iteration. He was older than the instructors, his slate skin gone pale and creased at the joints, and he spoke through a translator collar in a voice that came out flat and even. He told us the rules, which were that there were no rules. The cell would present a situation. We would do what we could. We would, almost certainly, die. And then we would begin again the same from the start. He told us the veilleur who had endured the most iterations would be honored. He did not look at the humans when he said it. I think he had already decided we were a curiosity, a side experiment, something to be noted and discarded. I did not blame him. I would have thought the same. Then they put me in a cell, and the door sealed, and the loop began. I will tell you what was in the cell because it matters, and because you should understand it was not some clever puzzle. It was a chamber flooded waist-deep with cold water, freezing, the kind of cold that takes your breath in the first second. The water was rising. There was a sealed hatch at the top of a smooth wall, 4 meters up, and no ladder, and no handholds you could see, and the lights were the harsh veilleur noon white, so there was no shadow to hide a hope in. The water rose. You had perhaps 6 minutes. Then it closed over the top of the chamber, and you drowned in the bright cold, alone, and the chamber knew you were dead, and it reset. The first time, I did what anyone would do. I thrashed. I clawed at the smooth wall. I found the seams of the hatch with my fingers and could not move it. I tried to brace across the corner and climb, and my boots slipped and I went under, and the cold took my breath, and I came up shouting, which is the only time in this whole account I shouted, and the water rose over my mouth, and then over my eyes, and the white light went green and then dark, and I drowned. And then I was standing at the start, dry in the bright cell, waist deep, with the water beginning to rise. I want to describe what that does to you the first time, because I have never been able to do it justice, and I will not manage it now. It is not like waking from a dream. You remember dying. You remember the green light and the cold in your chest. And here you are, dry, alive, with the same water rising, the same hatch, the same 6 minutes, and the absolute certainty that it will end the same way. There is a moment there where the floor of your mind drops out. I felt it. Even with my callus, I felt it, a single lurch, the sense of a thing too large to hold. And then a very old habit took over, the only thing I had that was bigger than the lurch. I looked at the water, I looked at the hatch, and I thought, all right, this is the shift then, let's see the shift. That is the entire secret. I am sorry if you wanted more. The second iteration I did not thrash. I used the 6 minutes to learn the cell. Cold water, yes, but I had worked in flooded galleries before and I knew the cold would not kill me as fast as the panic would, so I made myself breathe slow and I felt along every wall with my hands while the water rose. The hatch would not open. The walls were smooth. But in the back corner, underwater now, I found a recessed lip, a seam where 2 panels met, just deep enough to take the first joint of my fingers. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. But it was one thing I had not had the iteration before, and on a shift you take the one thing. I drowned again. The lip was not enough to climb, but I knew it was there now. Third iteration, I went straight to the corner. Fourth, I worked out that if I jammed my boot heel sideways into the lip and pressed my back into the adjoining wall, I could hold myself a half-meter clear of the floor, which bought nothing, because the water still rose past me, but it taught me the cell would let me brace. Fifth, I learned the rising water itself was the thing I had been ignoring, that if I let it lift me instead of fighting it, kept my back to the wall and rode it up with my boot in the lip walking the seam upward as the level climbed, I could reach a height the floor never let me reach. I drowned 5 times. I am telling you I drowned 5 times, and on the 6th I got a hand on the hatch frame at the top of the wall with the water at my chin, and the hatch still would not open, and I drowned a 6th time with my fingers an inch from it. But here is the thing the Veyer never expected, the thing that was happening in me while it happened. Nothing was happening in me. I was not bleeding. I was working a shift. Each reset was just the start of the shift again, and a man who has started the same shift 11,000 times does not come apart at the 11,001st. The sameness was not an enemy I had to endure. The sameness was the medium I had lived my whole life inside. It was water to a fish. I did not have to be brave about it because there was nothing to be brave against. There was only the work, and the work was the same as it had always been, which is to say, figure out the next one thing and do it and clock the next reset and figure out the one thing after that. On the other side of the wall, the Veyer cadets were dying differently than I was. I did not see it at first. We were each sealed in our own cells, but the trial ran in cycles, and between cycles they let us out into the hall to rest, and that is where I began to understand what the loop did to them. The first rest, after our 5th iteration, the 11 humans and the Veyer cadets came out together, and the Veyer came out wrong. They were young and slate-gray and beautiful, and they came out of those cells with something gone out of their eyes, that depth, that catching the light quality dulled, like a window with the room behind it gone dark. One of them, a tall cadet I would later know as Ossiel, stood very still in the middle of the hall with his 2 many-jointed hands held slightly out from his body, the way you hold your hands when you are not sure the floor is where you left it. The instructors watched from the gallery and made their notes. I sat on a bench and drank the water they gave us and did not say anything, because I did not have anything to say, and because I have always been a man who would rather watch. Valoran came down from the gallery during that first rest. He came to the human's bench. He had a way of folding down onto his many joints that made him seem to be lowering himself out of politeness, though I think it was only how the Veyer sat. He looked at the 11 of us with those dark wells of eyes, and through the flat translator voice, he asked how we found the trial. Most of us did not answer. One of the younger humans, a woman named Petra who had been some kind of distance swimmer before, said it was hard, and that she had gotten higher up the wall each time, and that she thought she could get the hatch if she had one more go. Valoran noted that. Then he looked at me. "And you," he said, "you are the oldest, you have failed 5 times. "That's about right," I said. "How do you feel?" he said. Not a question the way he said it, a measurement. I thought about it because I am slow and I like to answer true. Tired, I said. Cold, my knees are bad. The hatch is the puzzle. I'll get there or I won't. He was quiet a moment. The Veer have a stillness that is hard to read. Then he said, "You do not feel the recurrence." "The what?" "The sameness," he said. "The going around, the same cell, the same water. Again and again the same, you do not feel it." And I told him the truth, which was that I felt it fine. I just did not see why he was making a thing of it. I told him I had been going around the same shift for 31 years, and I supposed this was just a shorter shift with worse water. I did not say it to be clever. I genuinely did not understand yet that I had said something enormous. He looked at me for a long time. Then he stood, on all his joints, and went back up to the gallery, and I saw him say something to the instructors, and I saw the instructors go still in the way that meant they were paying attention. Osil survived 7 iterations before he broke. I want to tell you about Osil because he was the best of them, and because what happened to him is the part of this I am least at peace with. He was, the other Veer cadets told us in their halting way, marked from a young age. His lattice was reckoned among the finest in a generation. There had been talk that he might reach 8 iterations, perhaps even 9, that he might be carved into the wall. He carried it lightly, which is its own kind of strength. When we came out to rest, he was kind to the humans, curious about us, asked us through the translators what Earth was like, and listened to the answers as though they were gifts, which to him I suppose they were new things, fresh material for the lattice, a way of feeding the hunger that the cell starved. I liked him. I want that on the record. In another life I think Osil and I could have shared a shift. He went into his 8th iteration on the 3rd cycle, and he did not come out right. They told me later what his cell held. It was not water. Each cell tailored itself. The loop found the shape of the thing you would have to do and made you do it again and again. Osil's cell was a narrow ledge over a long fall in the white noonlight with a gap to cross and a handhold that gave way at the last instant every single time, so that every iteration ended with him reaching and the hold failing and the fall. The same reach, the same failing, the same fall. 8 times. 9. Into his 10th he went, past the legend, past the statue in the court with its open hands, further than any living Veer had gone, and somewhere in that 10th recurrence his lattice came apart. When they pulled him out he was not screaming. That was the worst of it. I had imagined it would be screaming. It was the opposite. He came out of the cell silent and smooth-faced and empty, his hands held out from his body, and when one of the instructors spoke his name he turned toward the voice with a slowness that had nothing behind it, like a door swinging in a draft. The depth in his eyes was gone and it did not come back. They led him away gently. 2 of the older instructors went with him, holding his arms, and the other cadets looked at the floor, because they knew, and I knew watching them know, that Osil had reached and the hold had failed one too many times, and the part of him that had been Osil had fallen with it and not gotten up. I had drowned by then 11 times. I went into the next cycle and drowned 3 more. It did not occur to me to be afraid of what had happened to Osil, and I have wondered since whether that was a mercy or a kind of blindness. I think it was neither. I think it was only that the thing that had broken him had no purchase on me. He had reached and failed and felt his mind tear on the sameness of it. I reached and failed and started the next shift. The reaching and the failing were the same for both of us. The sameness was not. It was after Osil that they brought in the first calibrator. I did not understand her rank at first. Her name was Eshmara, and she was old even by Valoran's measure, her slate skin gone nearly white, her joints slow, and when she entered the hall the instructors arranged themselves around her the way men arrange themselves around someone who can end them. She did not watch the cadets. She watched the readouts. The iteration hall, I learned, was wired through and through with instruments, every cell laced with sensors that measured the one thing the Veer cared about, the strain on a mind under recurrence, the bleeding of the lattice, the rate at which a self came apart under sameness. They had a number for it. The translator gave it to me eventually as recurrence load, and they read it the way I would read a methane gauge, a thing that tells you how close you are to the moment it all goes wrong. Every veyor in those cells ran a recurrence load that climbed with each iteration. It started low, it rose. Around the fourth or fifth iteration it began to climb steeply, and the steep climb was the bleeding, the lattice fraying, and when the load crossed a certain line the mind went the way Osseil's had gone. The whole trial was, at bottom, a race between solving the cell and crossing that line. Most veyor crossed the line first. That was the filter. That was the point. Eshmara had come because the instruments in the human cells were doing something the instruments had never done. They were not climbing. She had them run me again, and she stood at the readouts the whole time with Valoran beside her, and I drowned and learned the cell 1 cold inch at a time, and the whole while my recurrence load sat at the bottom of the gauge and did not move. Not low, not slowly climbing, flat. A flat line where every mind they had ever measured drew a rising curve. I was not winning the race against the line. I was not in the race. The line was somewhere far above me, and I was not climbing toward it at all, because the thing that made other minds climb, the bleeding, the starvation, the lattice turning on itself for want of the new, was simply not happening inside me. I did not know any of this while I was in the cell, of course. I was busy with the hatch. I will tell you how the hatch went, because it is the spine of the thing and I have made you wait. It took me in the end somewhere past 40 iterations. I lost the exact count and the veyor did not, but I stopped asking them, because the number had begun to do something to their faces, and I did not like watching it. 40-some times I went into that cold, bright cell with the rising water, and 40-some times I drowned, and each time I came out of it with one more thing than I had gone in with. I learned to ride the water up the back wall with my boot in the seam. I learned that the hatch had a recessed mechanism, a veyor design, that needed 2 points of pressure pushed inward at once, and that my hands alone could not span them. I learned that if I went up the wall fast, before the cold had stolen the strength from my fingers, I could get one hand to the first point. I learned, drowning, that the second point was set just out of reach of my other hand by the width of a palm, and that no amount of stretching would close that width, and that this was the cell's true cruelty. It had built a thing a single body could not do. So I stopped trying to do it with a single body's reach. It was an old trick, the thing I finally did, and it was not clever, and it was not strong, and it was not brave. It was just a foreman's trick, the kind of thing you learn when you have spent your life making bodies and tools and timing do work that no one of them could do alone. I worked out that I could brace my boot in the seam and press the first point with my hand, and then, riding the water, timing it to the rise, kick my other boot off the opposite wall in a short, hard shove, and strike the second point with the heel as I came across, both points pressed for the half-second the mechanism needed. It took me a dozen iterations just to get the timing of the kick. It took me a dozen more to do it without slipping. The first time both points went in together I was so cold and so far past surprise that I almost did not register the hatch grinding open above me, the white light spilling down, the way out, the end of the shift. I climbed out into the gallery dripping and shaking with the cold, and the iteration hall was silent in a way it had not been before, and Eshmara, the first calibrator, was looking not at me but at the readout in her hands, the long flat line of it, and Valoran was looking at me, the way a man looks at a thing he has decided he was wrong about. I thought that was the end of it. I had solved the cell. I had survived the trial. By any measure I understood I was done. They reset me. Not the cell I had beaten. They moved me to another, and the veyor around me grew quieter, and the gauges climbed for everyone but me, and I understood slowly that the solving had never been the point at all. Petra got her hatch on her 16th try, and they honored her, and she was glad, and I was glad for her, and they pulled her out of the rotation and kept me in it, because Petra's gauge, climbing slow but climbing, had a line in front of it the way every mind did, and they had found the edge of her, and the edge of her was a place that existed. They had not found the edge of me, and the veyor I was learning could not abide a thing whose edge they had not found. So they kept going. They put me through cell after cell, harder shapes, longer odds, and it stopped being about whether I could solve them. I solved some. Some I never solved and only drowned or fell or froze in over and over until they pulled me out and put me in the next. The solving was incidental now. They were chasing the line. They wanted to see my recurrence load climb. They needed to. A whole civilization had built its order on the certainty that every mind had that line in front of it. That sameness was the universal acid, that the only question was how long before it ate through you. And here was a slow old human with bad knees whose gauge would not move, and it was beginning, I think, to frighten them in a way that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what I meant. I want to be honest about what it cost, because the trackers say to be honest, and because it would be a lie to tell you it cost nothing. It cost. Not in the way it cost the veyor my lattice, if I have one, did not bleed, but a body is a body. Drowning, even with no death waiting on the far side of it, is still drowning. The cold is still cold. The chest still burns. I drowned and froze and fell more times than I will ever count, and each reset wiped the death away, but it did not wipe the tiredness, and the tiredness stacked. By the deep part of it I was a gray and shaking thing between cycles, my hands cramped half-closed from the cold, my bad knees gone to fire, sleeping the dreamless dead sleep of the truly spent and waking to do it again. I did not break, but I want it understood that not breaking is not the same as not suffering, and any man who tells you the two are the same has not done the work. And it cost me Osil in a way, though he was not mine to lose. I had liked him. I sat near him sometimes in the rests before, when there was still depth in his eyes, and after he broke I sat near the empty smooth-faced thing they had made of him too, on the few occasions they brought him through the hall, because it seemed wrong to me that the best of them should be passed by. He did not know me. He turned his head toward sounds. The hold had failed one too many times and he had gone over with it. I did not have the words in their language or mine for what I felt about that, and I am not sure I have them now. The nearest I can get is this. I had spent my life being grateful, on the bad mornings, for the callus over the place where dread should have been. Watching Osil, I understood for the first time that the callus had a cost I had never counted, and that the veyor, for all the trial did to them, had something I did not, a mind that still felt the sameness, that had never gone numb to it, that was still, even at the moment it tore, fully and terribly alive. I am not sure which of us the loop proved the better creature. I only know which of us walked out. It ended on a number I never learned, because by then I had told them to stop counting where I could hear it. They had me in a cell shaped like the worst of them. Not water, not a fall, but a long dim corridor, the only dim place in all that bright station, which I understood later was deliberate. The veyor reaching for the one stimulus they thought even a numb human could not endure, the absence of anything new at all, sameness distilled down to a gray nothing you had to walk through again and again with no puzzle to solve and no hatch to find and no end but the wall at the far side that killed you when you reached it. And then the start again, the same gray, the same walk, the same wall. No work in it. That was the cruelty. They had finally built a cell with no work, because work was the thing I lived inside, and they had guessed, rightly, that taking the work away was the only blow they had left. And they were right that it was hard. It was the hardest of all of them, that gray corridor with nothing in it, and I will not pretend otherwise. A man can endure almost anything if there is a next one thing to do. Take away the next one thing and you are left alone with the sameness itself, naked, and that is the closest I ever came in all of it to feeling what the veyor felt, a kind of vastness opening under the mind, the sense of a thing too large to hold. So I gave myself work. It is what a foreman does. There being no puzzle in the cell, I made one. I counted my steps and tried to make each walk exactly even. I named the gray. I held in my head the faces of a crew 31 years deep and walked them down the corridor with me one at a time, a man a step, and when I ran out of crew I started on the rock itself, the seams and faults of a working life, and walked those. I built a shift out of nothing, because nothing was what they had given me and a shift was what I knew how to make of it. And I walked, and I reached the wall, and I died, and I started again, and I built the shift again, the same shift gladly, because the same shift was the whole of what I had ever had, and it had never once failed to be enough. I do not know how many times, a great many, past the corridor's intent, past wherever they thought the gray would take me, and the gauge, they told me after, the gauge sat flat. Flat through the water and flat through the falls and flat through the gray nothing they had built to be unendurable. A flat line where every mind they had measured in the long history of the loop had drawn its rising curve and crossed its line and broken. The instrument that had read the breaking of Ossiel and 1,000 before him had nothing to read in me, because there was nothing there to read. I was not enduring the recurrence. To endure a thing, some part of you has to be fighting it. No part of me was fighting it. I had simply come home. They switched the loop off. I did not know they could. I do not think they had ever done it. The iteration hall had run, Valoran told me later, for longer than the Veer had records to measure, a thing as fixed in their world as the orbit of the station, the engine of their whole order, and they had never once had cause to stop it, because it had never once met a mind it could not finish. They stopped it for me. The white light in my gray corridor changed, and the wall at the far end did not kill me, and the door I had never been allowed to use opened on its own, and I walked out into the hall on my bad knees with my hands cramped half shut, and there was no next cell, because they had run out of cells to put me in. Eshmara, the first calibrator, was waiting, with the readout in her old white hands. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, the translator gave me her words flat and even, and I have carried them since. She said the loop had a single purpose, which was to find the edge of a mind. She said it had found the edge of every mind ever placed inside it. She said it had not found mine. And then she said the thing I think she had crossed her whole long life to say to someone, and had never had anyone to say it to. That she had been taught, as all the Veer were taught, that repetition tolerance was the rarest of all qualities, the trait of the ruler, the proof of the finest mind, and that she had spent her years believing the finest mind was the one that could bear the most sameness before it broke, and that I had taught her something the trial was not built to teach. That there was a kind of mind for which sameness was not a weight to be borne at all. That somewhere out in the dark there were creatures who did not endure the recurrence because they did not experience it as a thing apart from living. That we were not stronger than the Veer. We were simply made of the loop, and that this was either the most magnificent thing she had ever measured or the most frightening, and that at her age she no longer knew the difference between the two, and was not sure there was one. Then she had them carry Ossiel through, the smooth, empty thing they had made of him, on the way to wherever they kept the ones the loop had finished. And she stopped the bearers in front of me, I think on purpose, I think so that I would have to look. And I looked. I have thought about that a great deal since. About the two of us standing there at the end of the trial, the Veer who reached and felt the hold fail and felt it tear him apart, and the human who reached and felt nothing and walked out whole. They had built the loop to find the better mind. I do not believe to this day that it found one. I believe it found two kinds of mind, and that the kind that breaks and the kind that does not are not arranged on a ladder with one above the other, whatever the Veer had carved into their walls. Ossiel felt the sameness with everything he was, right up to the moment it took him. I did not feel it at all. He went over the edge fully alive, and I came home over the same edge gone half to stone. I will not tell you which of us the trial honored. I will only tell you that when they carried him past me, I put my cramped half-shut hand on his arm, the way you would touch a man going off shift for the last time, and he turned his head toward the touch with that slow, empty turning, toward the new thing, the only kind of thing his ruined lattice could still reach for. A touch he had not felt before. Something new at the very end of him. That was the only iteration of any of it I would have run again. They sent me home after. The Vair are not cruel in the way we are cruel. They had measured what they came to measure, and they had no use for me beyond it, and they returned me to earth with a courtesy that was almost gentle. And Valoran himself saw me off, folding down onto his many joints on the white deck to say a thing the translator gave me: as we have never found the edge of you, and we do not know what to do with a creature that has no edge. I told him the truth, which is the same truth I have told all the way through, and the only one I have. I told him there is an edge. I told him I just never had to find it because I had spent my whole life so far back from it, in the bright dull middle of the same shift, that the edge was something I had only ever heard about. I told him most of us are like that. I told him that is not strength. It is just where we live. He did not understand. I did not expect him to. A creature that lives for the new cannot be made to feel in his joints what it is to be made of the old. But he carried it away with him, the way I carried Eshmara's words away, and I have to believe it sits in his lattice still, a thing that will not slot in, a fact that does not fit the frame, fraying quietly at the edges of everything he thought he knew. I went back down into the dark at the start of a shift, the way I had 10,000 times before, and I came up in the dark at the end of it, and the gauge read what it read, and my knees ached, and the machine screamed their one long note, and it was the same, and the same, and the same. And I will tell you what I felt, going down that first morning back, into the cold and the dust and the going around that had made me into the one thing in the universe their deadliest trial could not finish. I felt like myself. I clocked in.